A racist police officer thought he could threaten a black woman, expecting a baby with impunity. But his plans go awry when an unexpected witness comes forward. Who is he and what did he do? Find out in our video. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments, what would you do in her place? The night had settled in, wrapping the city streets in a blanket of quiet. Kira leaned back in the driver's seat of her modest sedan, her hand gently resting on her growing belly. It had been a long day at work, and the exhaustion was creeping in. But tonight, as every night recently, her thoughts were not on herself, but on the life growing inside her. Her baby. The soft, fluttering movements beneath her hand reminded her that soon, very soon, she would be holding her child in her arms. The streetlights flickered past in a steady rhythm as Kira drove along the nearly deserted road. She glanced at the dashboard. It was nearing midnight. She should have been home by now, but the extra hours at work were becoming a necessity. The bills were piling up, and preparing for a baby on a single income was far from easy. But she managed, as she always did. Her mind wandered to thoughts of the future, the nursery she hadn't finished decorating yet, the name she was still unsure of, and the looming question of how to raise a black child in a world that still seemed so hostile. Kira often found herself worrying about what kind of future her baby would face. Would they be safe? Would they be treated fairly? The world she lived in didn't give her many reasons to feel optimistic, but tonight, all those worries seemed distant. All she wanted was to get home, kick off her shoes, and rest. The soft hum of the engine and the steady beat of the tires on the road had a calming effect, easing the tension from her shoulders. Just as she began to relax, the distant flicker of blue and red lights pierced the rearview mirror. At first, Kira thought nothing of it. A police car on a night patrol, perhaps. But as the lights grew closer, she realized they weren't passing her. They were following her. Her heart skipped a beat. She glanced at her speedometer. She wasn't speeding. There was no reason for them to pull her over, was there? The lights flashed more insistently, and the siren blared briefly. Kira's stomach clenched. She had no choice. She signaled and pulled over to the side of the road, the street suddenly feeling much darker and more desolate than it had moments ago. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the sudden surge of anxiety that pulsed through her. She hadn't done anything wrong, she reminded herself. There was no reason to be afraid. But deep down, Kira knew that wasn't entirely true. She had heard too many stories. Encounters that started like this, innocently enough, but ended in tragedy. Stories of black men and women stopped for no reason, only to be harassed, or worse. She rolled down the window as the police cruiser pulled up behind her. The flashing lights bathed the interior of her car in an eerie red and blue glow. Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel, and she reminded herself to breathe. Footsteps approached, heavy and deliberate. Kira's pulse quickened, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. The officer's shadow stretched long in the headlights as he approached her car. She could feel the weight of the moment, the air around her thick with tension. Something didn't feel right. "License and registration," the officer barked, before he even reached the window. His tone was harsh, impatient. Kira fumbled with her purse, her hands suddenly shaking as she pulled out her wallet and handed over her license. She could feel his eyes on her, scrutinizing her every movement. The officer, a tall, broad-shouldered white man, with a hard expression etched onto his face, glanced at her license and then at her. His eyes narrowed slightly, and Kira could feel the shift in the air. It was subtle, but she knew it well. The look, the one that said he had already made up his mind about her, based on nothing more than the color of her skin. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. Kira froze. Step out of the vehicle. For what? She hadn't done anything. Her mind raced as she tried to think of a reason why he would be asking her to get out. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her hand instinctively moved to her belly, as if to shield the child within her from the danger that suddenly seemed so close. "Officer," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "I'm just on my way home. I haven't done anything wrong." "I said, step out of the vehicle," he repeated, his voice low and threatening now. His hand tightened on his gun, and Kira's fear spiked. This wasn't just a routine stop anymore. She could feel it in the way he looked at her, the way his eyes flicked to her skin, the disdain in his voice. She hesitated, and the officer's face twisted into a sneer. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Or do you think the rules don't apply to you?" Kira's mind reeled. Every instinct screamed at her to stay in the car, to not make any sudden moves. But she also knew that defiance could escalate things quickly. She had seen it happen before. One wrong move, one misunderstood action, and things could spiral out of control. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, I'm just trying to get home." The officer's sneer deepened. "That doesn't change anything. Out of the car now." Reluctantly, Kira unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door. The night air was cool against her skin, but it did nothing to calm the rising tide of fear within her. She stood up slowly, her hands instinctively moving to cradle her belly. She hoped, prayed, that he would see her vulnerability, that it might soften whatever anger or prejudice was driving his actions. But as his eyes flicked to her stomach, there was no sign of sympathy, only cold disdain. "Hands on the hood," he barked, and Kira's heart sank. This was worse than she had feared. She was being treated like a criminal, with no explanation, no reason. Her mind raced with thoughts of what could happen next. Handcuffs, an arrest, and in her condition, the thought was unbearable. "Officer, please," she tried again, her voice shaking now. "I don't understand. What did I do?" The officer stepped closer, looming over her as she hesitated to comply. His hand moved to the gun on his belt, and Kira knew she had no choice. She turned and placed her hands on the hood of her car, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Every fiber of her being screamed that this was wrong, that she shouldn't be treated this way. But what could she do? The officer roughly patted her down, his hands uncomfortably close to her stomach. Kira clenched her teeth, tears stinging her eyes. She had never felt so powerless, so completely at the mercy of someone else's hatred. When he was done, he stepped back, glaring at her with a twisted smile. "You matched the description of someone we're looking for," he said, though there was no doubt in her mind that he was lying. He had already decided she was guilty of something. It didn't matter what. Kira's mind spun. This couldn't be happening. She was an innocent woman, just trying to get home. How could things have gone so wrong, so quickly? "Get back in the car," he snapped, his tone as harsh as ever. "Don't make me tell you again." Kira obeyed, her legs trembling as she climbed back into the driver's seat. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, like a predator watching its prey. Her hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. As the officer returned to his car, Kira took a deep, shaky breath, trying to calm herself. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. She was in danger, and she didn't know how to get out of it. Kira sat in her car, her body trembling with fear. She gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white, trying to steady her shaking hands. The cold air from the open window seemed to cling to her skin, but the chill in her bones had nothing to do with the weather. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and her heart continued to pound violently in her chest. She tried to calm herself, to think rationally, but her mind was racing, spiraling out of control. Her baby shifted inside her, a gentle reminder that she was not alone in this. Kira instinctively placed her hand on her belly, a small, protective gesture, as though she could shield the child from the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. She had never felt so vulnerable, so utterly at the mercy of another person. And that person, the officer, was still watching her, his eyes cold and judgmental, his hand never far from his weapon. In the rearview mirror, she saw him step out of his cruiser once again, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were savoring the control he had over her. Every step he took felt like a hammer blow, each one echoing louder than the last. Kira could barely hear anything over the rush of her own pulse, but she forced herself to focus. He approached her car once more, leaning down into the window, his presence oppressive, his face twisted into a sneer. There was something in his eyes that made her stomach churn, a kind of gleeful malice that went beyond the uniform he wore. This wasn't just a traffic stop. This was something far worse, and she could feel it in her bones. "Step out again," he said, his voice dripping with disdain, as if every word she spoke disgusted him. Kira blinked in confusion. Again? She had already complied. What more did he want from her? She hesitated, trying to gather her thoughts, trying to understand what was happening. "Now," he snapped, slamming his hand on the roof of her car with a loud bang that made Kira flinch. Kira glanced in the rearview mirror again, hoping for some sign that this nightmare was about to end. But the officer was still in his car, watching, waiting. Suddenly, he stepped out again, this time with something different in his stance, something that made Kira's stomach turn. He wasn't done. He approached her car once more, but this time, he wasn't alone. A second officer had arrived. They exchanged a few quiet words before both men turned their attention back to her. The new arrival was slightly shorter, but just as intimidating, his expression unreadable. Kira's pulse quickened. Why was there another officer? What were they planning? The original officer, Davidson, approached her window again, his hand still on his gun. "Get out of the car," he ordered once more, his voice even harsher than before. Kira's heart raced. "Why? What did I do?" Her voice cracked under the pressure of her fear. He smirked, enjoying her panic. "You fit the description of someone involved in a robbery nearby. We need to search your vehicle." Her stomach dropped. Robbery? She had nothing to do with any robbery. She had been at work all day. This was a lie, a setup, and they both knew it. But what could she do? She had no power here. "No," she said, her voice trembling. "That's not true. I didn't." "Step out of the car," he interrupted, his tone final. Kira's heart pounded in her chest as she slowly reached for the door handle, the fear of what was coming next overwhelming her. Kira's breath caught in her throat as she gripped the door handle. Her mind screamed at her to stay in the car, to lock the doors, to do anything but follow his orders, but she knew better. She had seen enough stories on the news, stories of people who refused to comply, and how quickly things spiraled out of control. One wrong move, one misunderstood gesture, and she might never make it home. She pushed the door open slowly, feeling the cold night air wash over her as she stepped out. Her legs trembled beneath her, every muscle tense, as though her body knew something her mind wasn't ready to accept yet. She placed a protective hand on her belly, the only thing grounding her in this nightmare. Both officers stood in front of her now, their expressions unreadable, their hands hovering near their holsters. The first officer, Davidson, who had harassed her from the beginning, still wore that smirk of satisfaction on his face. It was as though he was relishing in her fear, feeding off it. The second officer, taller but quieter, merely watched her, his eyes dark and emotionless. "Turn around," Davidson ordered again, his voice carrying the weight of someone who knew he had all the power. Hands on the car. Kira hesitated for only a moment, but it was long enough for Davidson to step forward and shove her roughly toward the hood of the car. She stumbled, barely catching herself before her stomach hit the metal. A sharp pain shot through her side, and she gasped, instinctively clutching her belly. "Please," Kira whispered, her voice shaking. "I'm pregnant. You're hurting me." Davidson's sneer deepened as he leaned in close to her ear. "You think I care," he hissed. "I don't give a damn about you or that bastard you're carrying." The words hit her like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, the world tilted. Kira could barely process the hatred laced in his voice. Her vision blurred with tears, but she blinked them back, refusing to let him see her cry. She had to stay strong, if not for herself, then for her child. Her hands pressed against the cold hood of the car, and her body trembled under the weight of the situation. She could feel the cold metal of the handcuffs snap tightly around her wrists, the sharp edges biting into her skin. Davidson pulled her arms behind her back with unnecessary force, and a sharp pain shot up her shoulders. Kira cried out involuntarily, her voice breaking through the silence of the night. "Shut up," Davidson barked, yanking her arms even tighter. Kira's legs wobbled beneath her, but she forced herself to stay upright. Falling would only make things worse. Behind her, the second officer remained silent, his gaze cold as he watched the scene unfold. Kira turned her head slightly, her eyes pleading with him to step in, to do something, anything, but he simply stood there, impassive, as if this were just another routine stop, as if the woman in front of him wasn't being humiliated and brutalized for no reason. "Why are you doing this?" Kira managed to ask, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I haven't done anything." Davidson chuckled darkly. "You people never think you've done anything, do you? Always the victims, always innocent." He spat the words like venom, each one cutting deeper than the last. "You fit the description. That's all I need." Her pulse pounded in her ears, drowning out the sound of his voice. Fit the description. She knew exactly what that meant. She had heard those words before. They had been used to justify countless injustices, countless brutalities against people who looked like her. It was always the same excuse, the same lie. "I didn't rob anyone," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I was at work all day. Please, you can check. I don't care." Davidson cut her off, his hand gripping her shoulder tightly, his fingers digging into her skin. "You're guilty until I say otherwise." Kira felt her knees buckle slightly beneath the weight of his words, but she forced herself to stay upright. She couldn't let him see her break. Not now, not when she was so close to losing everything. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to de-escalate the situation. But no matter how hard she tried to think clearly, her thoughts were clouded by fear. Every breath felt like a struggle, every second a battle to maintain control of her own body. The second officer finally spoke, his voice low and measured. "Let's just search the car and be done with it, Davidson. No need to drag this out." Kira's heart skipped a beat. Search the car? They had no right. They had no reason to suspect her of anything. She hadn't done anything wrong, but the second officer's words had been laced with indifference, as if he knew how this would end, and didn't care. Davidson's smirk widened, clearly pleased with himself. "That's exactly what we're going to do." Without waiting for her consent, he turned and gestured for the other officer to help him. Together, they approached the car, their movements deliberate and slow, like wolves circling their prey. Kira watched in horror as they began to rummage through her belongings, tossing her things carelessly onto the ground. Papers, her purse, a jacket, everything she had in the car was now being treated as if it were evidence of some fabricated crime. She wanted to scream, to demand they stop, but she knew it would be futile. Her voice held no power here. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. Kira stood helpless, her wrists aching in the tight cuffs, her body trembling as the cold night air bit at her exposed skin. Her baby shifted inside her, a small reminder of what was at stake, and she closed her eyes, trying to breathe through the fear. "Nothing here," the second officer finally said, stepping back from the car. He sounded almost disappointed, as if he had expected to find something that would justify their actions. Davidson straightened up, his expression darkening. "That doesn't mean she's innocent," he muttered under his breath. The second officer shrugged. "Let's just bring her in for questioning. We can hold her overnight. Maybe she'll talk." Kira's heart dropped. Hold her overnight? For what? She hadn't done anything wrong. But that didn't seem to matter to them. They had already decided her guilt, and nothing she could say would change their minds. "I have a child," Kira said desperately, her voice rising. "I'm pregnant. You can't." Davidson stepped forward and grabbed her by the arm, yanking her toward his cruiser. "I can do whatever I want," he growled, his voice filled with malice. "You should have thought about that before you decided to act suspicious." Her heart pounded painfully in her chest as she stumbled forward, her body barely able to keep up with the force of his pull. Every step felt like a countdown to disaster, each one taking her further from safety and closer to a fate she couldn't control. But just as they reached the police car, headlights cut through the darkness, casting long shadows on the ground. Kira blinked in surprise, her mind struggling to process what was happening. Another car? Was this more backup? Her stomach churned at the thought of more officers arriving. More people who could twist this situation further out of her control. The headlights pulled closer, and the car came to a stop behind the police cruiser. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Kira held her breath, her heart hammering in her chest. Was this help? Or was this just the next phase of her nightmare? The door of the car opened, and a figure stepped out, a man, dressed in civilian clothes. He looked around, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene in front of him. In his hand was something Kira hadn't expected, a camera. Davidson stiffened, his hand tightening around Kira's arm as he turned to face the newcomer. The second officer exchanged a glance with Davidson, his expression uneasy. "What the hell are you doing here?" Davidson demanded, his voice rising with anger. The man with the camera didn't respond immediately. Instead, he lifted the device and aimed it squarely at the officers and Kira. The soft red light of the camera's record function blinked in the darkness, and Kira felt a flicker of hope for the first time that night. The man's voice was calm but firm. "I'm filming this." Davidson's face contorted with rage. "Turn that damn thing off," he snarled, releasing Kira's arm and taking a step toward the man. "You have no right to film us." "I have every right," the man replied evenly, not lowering the camera. "I'm documenting police misconduct. What you're doing to her is illegal, and I've got it all on tape." Kira's breath caught in her throat. Was this really happening? Was someone finally standing up for her? The second officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of how to proceed. "Davidson, maybe we should—" "Shut up," Davidson snapped, his face twisting in fury. "I don't care who he is. We're in control here." The man with the camera didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his calm demeanor in stark contrast to Davidson's growing rage. "You're not in control anymore," he said, his voice steady. "You've been caught, and this footage is going to make sure you're held accountable." Kira's heart raced, her pulse thundering in her ears. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that this nightmare was finally coming to an end. But Davidson wasn't the type to back down easily. She could see the fury in his eyes, the hatred bubbling beneath the surface. The officer took another step toward the man, his hand twitching toward his gun. "You think this is going to stop me?" he growled. "You think—" But before he could finish, another set of headlights appeared on the horizon, this time moving fast. A second car, this one unmistakably a police vehicle, barreled down the road toward them. The blue and red lights flashed in the distance, growing brighter with each passing second. For the first time that night, Kira felt a surge of hope. Real backup. Real help. Maybe, just maybe, She was going to survive this. The second set of flashing police lights grew brighter as the new vehicle approached, cutting through the oppressive darkness that had hung over Kira like a storm cloud. Her pulse raced, and she struggled to steady her breathing. The man with the camera continued to record, his calmness in stark contrast to the fury radiating from Officer Davidson. The hope that had flickered within Kira started to grow, but the fear of what might happen next still held her in its grip. The police cruiser screeched to a stop just behind Davidson's car, its headlights casting long, eerie shadows across the road. The new officers emerged quickly, their faces unreadable in the chaotic mix of flashing lights and darkness. Kira strained to see their expressions, desperate to know if they were there to help or if they would simply continue the nightmare she was trapped in. Davidson's face was a storm of anger and resentment as he watched them approach. He glanced at the camera once more, his lips curling into a snarl. It was clear that he was losing control of the situation, and the realization only fueled his aggression. The first officer from the new cruiser stepped forward, his hand resting on his belt, though not near his gun. He looked younger than Davidson, but there was a seriousness in his eyes that made Kira hopeful. He surveyed the scene, taking in Kira's terrified expression, her swollen belly, the man with the camera, and the pile of her belongings scattered on the ground. "What's going on here, Davidson?" the officer asked, his voice steady but firm. There was an undertone of authority that suggested he was not interested in excuses. Davidson's face twitched with annoyance, but he kept his voice steady. "We're handling a suspect," he said, nodding toward Kira. "She fits the description of someone involved in a robbery nearby. We're just conducting a search." The younger officer glanced at Kira again, his gaze softening as he took in her obvious distress. Her wrists were still bound in handcuffs, her body trembling as she leaned against the hood of her car. Her hand rested protectively over her belly, and the fear in her eyes was impossible to ignore. "And you think a pregnant woman is responsible for this robbery?" the younger officer asked, raising an eyebrow. Davidson's face darkened. "I'm following procedure," he snapped. "I don't make the rules. She fits the description." The second officer from the new cruiser had been standing back, observing quietly, but now he stepped forward, his voice calm and measured. "What's the exact description, Davidson?" Davidson hesitated for the briefest of moments, his eyes darting toward Kira and then back to the officers. "Female, black, driving a vehicle that matches hers," he said curtly, as if that were all the explanation needed. The younger officer narrowed his eyes. "That's it? That's the description." Davidson's jaw clenched, the frustration evident in his every movement. "You think I don't know how to do my job?" The officer didn't respond to the provocation. Instead, he turned his attention to the man with the camera, who had remained silent, but continued to record the entire interaction. "And you are?" the officer asked, his tone still calm. "I'm documenting this," the man replied evenly. "This is clearly an abuse of power. I've been filming since I arrived." The younger officer nodded slightly, then turned back to Davidson. "If she's truly a suspect, why didn't you bring her in immediately? Why did you need to escalate things like this?" Davidson's face turned red with anger, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "I don't have to explain myself to you," he spat. "I know what I'm doing." But the tension in the air had shifted. The younger officer was no longer buying into Davidson's narrative, and it was clear that the situation was rapidly slipping out of Davidson's control. Kira watched, her heart pounding, as the power dynamics between the officers shifted right before her eyes. Davidson was no longer in charge. The second officer from the new cruiser stepped closer to Kira, his eyes scanning her face with concern. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Kira swallowed hard, her throat dry and tight. I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't do anything wrong. I'm just trying to get home. The officer nodded, his expression softening. We're going to get this sorted out. Okay, just hang tight. His words were a small comfort, but Kira still felt the weight of the handcuffs digging into her wrists. The cold metal a constant reminder of how easily this situation could turn again. She didn't know whether to trust him, didn't know if this was truly the end of her ordeal. Behind her, Davidson's anger was reaching a boiling point. He stepped forward, his body tense, and jabbed a finger toward the younger officer. You think you know better than me, huh? You think you can just walk in here and tell me how to do my job? The younger officer didn't flinch. I think we need to de-escalate this situation before it gets any worse. Davidson's face twisted with rage. She's guilty. I know it. You just don't have the guts to handle this the way it needs to be handled. Back off, Davidson, the second officer said, his voice rising slightly in warning. We're not going to escalate this any further. For a moment, it seemed as though Davidson might lose control completely. His face was flushed, his fists clenched, and his hand hovered near his gun. Kira held her breath, every muscle in her body tense with fear. If he drew that gun. But then, as though something inside him snapped, Davidson took a step back. His breathing was ragged, his face still contorted with fury, but he didn't move to draw his weapon. Instead, he spat on the ground in disgust and turned away from the group. Fine, he muttered. Handle it your way. See how that works out for you. The tension in the air began to ease, and Kira felt a small wave of relief wash over her. But she knew it wasn't over yet, not entirely. The younger officer stepped forward and unlocked the handcuffs from Kira's wrists, his touch gentle as he removed the restraints. The weight of the cuffs fell away, and Kira instinctively rubbed her sore wrists, her breath coming in shallow, shaky bursts. I'm sorry this happened, the officer said quietly. You didn't deserve any of this. Kira nodded, too exhausted and shaken to respond properly. The pain in her wrists was nothing compared to the emotional trauma that had settled deep in her chest. Her mind was still racing, replaying the events of the night over and over. The second officer, the one who had asked if she was okay, turned back toward the police cruiser. We'll be filing a report on this, he said, loud enough for Davidson to hear. You need to step aside, Davidson. This isn't your case anymore. Davidson let out a derisive laugh, but he didn't protest further. Instead, he turned toward his own cruiser, muttering something under his breath as he opened the door and climbed inside. The sound of the door slamming echoed through the night, and then the engine roared to life. Kira watched as Davidson's cruiser sped away into the night, the red and blue lights fading into the distance. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with the weight of everything that had just transpired. The man with the camera stepped closer, lowering the device now that Davidson was gone. He looked at Kira with a mixture of concern and relief. Are you okay? He asked gently. Kira nodded slowly, though the truth was she didn't know if she was okay. She didn't know if she ever would be after this. But she was alive. She had made it through the nightmare. That had to count for something. The officers stayed with her a little longer, helping her gather her belongings from the ground and making sure she had everything she needed. The man with the camera offered her a ride home, but Kira shook her head. She needed to drive herself. She needed to feel like she still had some semblance of control over her life, after everything that had been taken from her tonight. As she climbed back into her car, her hands still trembling on the steering wheel, she glanced up at the officers. They had handled the situation as best they could, but the reality of what had happened still hung heavy in the air. They had stopped Davidson before things could get worse, but the damage had already been done. Kira took a deep breath, her body aching with exhaustion, and turned the key in the ignition. The engine rumbled to life, and she pulled away from the scene, the weight of the night pressing down on her like a vice. She didn't know what would come next, but for now, she just needed to get home. Kira drove in silence, the road ahead of her illuminated by the soft glow of her headlights. The events of the night played over and over in her mind like a broken record. Her hands were still trembling on the wheel, and her heart hadn't quite settled back into a normal rhythm. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on her chest, leaving her breathless. She had made it through, but the fear, the humiliation, and the anger still lingered, gnawing at her insides. She kept glancing at her reflection in the rearview mirror, almost as if she needed to remind herself that she was still here, that she had survived. Her wrists still throbbed where the handcuffs had cut into her skin, and every time she moved, her muscles ached from the strain of standing in the cold, bent over the hood of her car, humiliated and powerless. But more than the physical pain was the emotional toll. The words Davidson had spat at her still echoed in her mind. "You people never think you've done anything, do you? Always the victims, always innocent." It wasn't just the hate in his voice that haunted her. It was the reminder that, to him and to so many others, she was nothing more than a target. Her pregnancy, her innocence, none of it mattered. In his eyes, her guilt had been decided the moment he laid eyes on her skin. As Kira turned onto the quieter streets near her neighborhood, she felt the tears prickling at her eyes again. She blinked rapidly, trying to hold them back. She couldn't afford to break down now. She just needed to get home, to be in her own space, where she could breathe, where she could think clearly. Her baby shifted in her belly, reminding her that she wasn't alone. She rubbed her hand gently across her stomach, trying to find comfort in that small, steady movement. But just as she started to relax, her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. She jumped slightly, her nerves still on edge, but reached over to grab it. It was a call from an unknown number. Hesitating for a moment, she considered letting it go to voicemail, but something urged her to answer. "Hello?" Her voice was hoarse, still shaky from the night's ordeal. "Kira Thompson." The voice on the other end was formal, authoritative. It wasn't a voice she recognized. "Yes, this is Kira. This is Captain Reynolds from the Internal Affairs Division of the Police Department. I've been informed of the incident that took place tonight involving Officer Davidson. I'd like to meet with you as soon as possible." Kira's grip tightened on the phone. Internal Affairs? She had heard of them before. They were the ones who investigated misconduct within the police force. Was this finally it? Was Davidson about to face the consequences of his actions? I don't know if I'm ready to talk about it, Kira admitted, her voice trembling. It was a lot. "I understand," Captain Reynolds said, his tone softening slightly. "But what you went through tonight is part of something much bigger. Officer Davidson has been under investigation for a long time. We need your testimony, and we need to talk about what happens next." The weight of his words settled over her like a heavy blanket. She wasn't just another victim of a racist cop. She was part of an ongoing investigation. Davidson wasn't some rogue officer with a bad attitude. He was part of something deeper, something more dangerous. Kira's mind raced. How many others had there been? How many people had suffered like she had? Or worse? "Okay," she said quietly, her decision made. "I'll meet with you." "When?" "Tomorrow morning," Captain Reynolds replied. "I'll send you the details." As soon as the call ended, Kira felt the weight of the situation press down on her even harder. She had just wanted to go home and forget about the nightmare she had lived through. But now it was clear. This was far from over. She wasn't just a victim in this story. She was now a key player in a much larger fight for justice. The next morning, Kira arrived at the Internal Affairs office, her nerves still frayed, but her resolve steady. She hadn't been able to sleep, her mind churning with questions and fears about what lay ahead. But she knew she had to do this. If there was any chance to hold Davidson accountable for what he had done, she had to take it. Captain Reynolds met her in the lobby, a tall, graying man with a serious expression. He extended a hand, and Kira shook it, though she could feel the tension in the air between them. "Thank you for coming," he said, as he led her down the hallway to a small, dimly lit conference room. "I know this isn't easy, but it's important." Kira sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as Captain Reynolds took the seat across from her. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of what was about to be discussed hanging heavily in the air. "I'm going to be honest with you, Kira," Captain Reynolds began, his voice low and steady. "Officer Davidson has been a problem for a long time. We've received numerous complaints about him over the years, but it's been difficult to build a solid case against him. He's well protected within the department." Kira's stomach turned at the thought. Davidson's smugness, his confidence in his ability to do whatever he wanted without consequence. It made sense now. He had people protecting him, people who were more interested in covering up his actions than holding him accountable. Captain Reynolds continued, his face grim. "But last night's incident was different. The video that was recorded, along with your testimony, could be the turning point. We finally have the evidence we need to take him down." Kira's heart pounded in her chest. Could it really be true? Could she really help bring this man to justice? "Your testimony is critical," Reynolds said, his eyes locking onto hers. "We need you to tell us everything. What happened, what he said, how he treated you. The more details you can give, the stronger our case will be." Kira took a deep breath, her mind flashing back to the terror of the night before. She could still feel the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into her wrists, still hear Davidson's hateful words. But she knew she had to relive it all, to make sure he could never do this to anyone else. She started from the beginning, the moment the flashing lights appeared in her rearview mirror, the way Davidson had treated her from the very start. She told Captain Reynolds about the way he had shoved her against the car, how he had handcuffed her without any explanation, how he had insulted her, degraded her, all while knowing she was pregnant. She spared no detail, recounting the fear that had gripped her, the helplessness she had felt as he tore through her belongings, searching for something that didn't exist. As she spoke, Captain Reynolds listened intently, taking notes, occasionally nodding in acknowledgement. His expression never wavered, but Kira could tell that what she was saying wasn't new to him. He had heard stories like this before, maybe too many. When she finished, the room fell silent again. Kira could feel the tension in her chest loosening, as if speaking the truth had lifted some of the weight from her shoulders. But she knew it wasn't over, not yet. Captain Reynolds leaned forward slightly, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. "There's something else you need to know. Davidson isn't just under investigation for what happened last night. He's been involved in several incidents, and we have reason to believe he's part of a larger network of officers who've been engaging in corrupt and illegal activities for years." Kira's heart skipped a beat. She had expected Davidson to be a bad cop, a racist who abused his power, but this, a network of officers, corruption, the scale of it was staggering. Reynolds continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "We've been investigating him for a long time, but it's been difficult to get anyone on the inside to talk. Most of the officers involved are careful, and they protect each other. But now, with the video and your testimony, we have a real chance of exposing them." The gravity of the situation hit Kira like a freight train. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something much bigger, something that had been festering within the police department for years, maybe decades. She had walked into the middle of a fight she hadn't even known existed, a fight for justice that went far beyond one night of terror. "Will it be enough?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. "Will my testimony really make a difference?" Captain Reynolds met her gaze, his expression serious but determined. "It could be, but we need you to stay strong, to stand by your story. If we can bring Davidson down, we can start taking down the others." Kira nodded, the weight of his words settling on her shoulders. She hadn't asked for this fight, but now that she was in it, she couldn't back down. Not when there was a chance to make sure no one else would have to go through what she did. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady now. "I'll testify. I'll do whatever it takes." Captain Reynolds gave her a small, approving nod. "Good. We'll prepare you for the case. This isn't going to be easy, Kira, but you're doing the right thing." As Kira left the Internal Affairs office that day, a new sense of purpose filled her. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been hurt by people like Davidson. And no matter how hard it was, she wasn't going to let them down. The days following Kira's decision to testify against Officer Davidson were filled with anxiety and preparation. She met with lawyers from the Internal Affairs Division, sat through hours of briefings, and went over her testimony multiple times. Each time she retold the story, it became harder to relive the humiliation and fear she had felt that night. Yet, with each retelling, her resolve grew stronger. She wasn't just doing this for herself. She was doing it for every other victim who hadn't had the chance to stand up against the system that had failed them. The investigation into Davidson and his network of corrupt officers had taken a sharp turn after the video of her traffic stop began circulating. The footage was damning. The sight of a pregnant woman being handcuffed, thrown against the hood of her car, and harassed without cause spread rapidly, sparking outrage across the city. It was the kind of irrefutable evidence that the public couldn't ignore, and suddenly the police department found itself under intense scrutiny. Kira had been hesitant to watch the video at first. She didn't want to relive the worst moments of her life through the cold, detached lens of a camera. But as the investigation picked up steam and she prepared for her day in court, she realized that the video had become a symbol, not just of what had been done to her, but of the larger fight against police brutality and racial profiling. Every night Kira struggled to sleep. The weight of the trial, the knowledge that her words could bring down not just Davidson, but an entire system of corruption, kept her awake. Her mind would drift to the what-ifs. What if Davidson walked free? What if the other officers involved were never brought to justice? What if the system that had protected him for so long continued to shield him and others like him? Her baby kicked inside her, a constant reminder of why she was fighting so hard. She had to believe that she was doing this to create a better world for her child. A world where they wouldn't have to live in fear of those sworn to protect them. The day of the trial arrived faster than Kira had expected. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. Reporters filled the back rows, their cameras flashing as she entered the room. Kira felt their eyes on her, the pressure mounting with each step she took toward the witness stand. She had never wanted to be the center of attention, but now, with the city watching, she had no choice. Davidson sat at the defendant's table, flanked by his attorneys. He looked different without his uniform, smaller, less intimidating, but the smug look on his face was the same. He was confident, even now, that he could escape justice. Kira could see it in the way he sat, his shoulders relaxed, his eyes barely acknowledging her. He thought he was untouchable. Captain Reynolds had warned her that this trial would be difficult. Davidson's defense team would do everything in their power to discredit her, to paint her as an unreliable witness. But Kira had prepared herself for this. She wasn't going to be intimidated, not by Davidson, and not by the system that had protected him for so long. The prosecutor stood and called Kira to the stand. Her heart raced as she walked to the witness box, the weight of the moment settling heavily on her shoulders. She sat down, her hands trembling slightly as she took the oath. As she began her testimony, The courtroom fell silent. Kira recounted the events of that night in detail. How she had been driving home, how Davidson had pulled her over for no reason, how he had treated her with contempt from the moment he approached her car. She described the fear she had felt, the way he had handcuffed her despite knowing she was pregnant, and the words he had spat at her, filled with hate and prejudice. The prosecutor guided her through each step of the encounter, ensuring that the jury heard every detail. Kira could feel the eyes of the jury on her, their expressions growing more serious with each word she spoke. She could tell that they were listening, that they were beginning to understand the gravity of what had happened to her. When the prosecutor played the video for the courtroom, Kira forced herself to watch. It was harder than she had imagined. Seeing herself on that screen, vulnerable and terrified, made her chest tighten with a familiar ache. But she didn't look away. She couldn't. This was her truth, and the world needed to see it. The video played out in the same cold, unfeeling way it had been recorded. The sound of Davidson's voice, the roughness of his movements, the clear disdain in his actions. There was no denying what had happened. The courtroom was silent when the video ended, the weight of the evidence settling heavily over the room. When Davidson's attorney finally stood to cross-examine her, Kira braced herself. She knew this was coming. The defense would try to twist her words, to make it seem as though she had been at fault. But Kira had come too far to back down now. The attorney's questions were sharp, designed to poke holes in her story. He questioned her memory, asked if she had been emotional or overreacting during the encounter. He tried to imply that her pregnancy might have made her more sensitive, more likely to perceive a threat where there wasn't one. Kira answered each question with a calm, steady voice. She refused to let him manipulate her. She had lived through that night, and nothing he said could change what had happened. The truth was on her side, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. As the cross-examination dragged on, Kira noticed that Davidson's smug expression had faded. He wasn't so confident now. The defense's attempts to discredit her were falling flat. The jury wasn't buying it. The trial stretched on for days, with witness after witness called to the stand. Other victims of Davidson's abuse testified, their stories echoing Kira's in disturbing detail. The web of corruption within the department began to unravel, and it became clear that this was more than just the actions of one rogue officer. It was a system designed to protect men like him. When the final arguments were made, Kira sat in the courtroom, her heart pounding as the jury was sent to deliberate. The hours dragged on, each minute stretching into an eternity. Kira couldn't stop fidgeting, her mind racing with every possible outcome. What if the jury didn't convict him? What if he walked free? Finally, the jury returned. The courtroom fell silent as the foreman stood to deliver the verdict. Kira's heart felt like it might burst from her chest as she waited for the words that would determine her future, and the future of countless others who had suffered under Davidson's hand. Guilty. The word hung in the air like a lifeline, and Kira felt the tension in her body release in a rush of emotion. Davidson had been found guilty. He would face the consequences of his actions. For the first time in what felt like forever, Kira allowed herself to breathe. As Davidson was led away in handcuffs, his face twisted in fury, Kira watched him go with a sense of relief. Justice had been served, but she knew this wasn't the end. The fight against police brutality and systemic racism wasn't over. This was just one victory in a much larger battle. In the weeks following the trial, Kira found herself at the center of a growing movement for police reform. Her story, and the video that had exposed Davidson, had become a rallying cry for those demanding change. Protests erupted across the city, calling for an end to the corrupt practices that had allowed men like Davidson to operate unchecked for so long. Kira was invited to speak at rallies, her voice becoming one of the many that called for accountability and justice. She spoke not just for herself, but for every victim who had been silenced, every life that had been torn apart by abuse of power. She had never imagined that her life would take this path, but now that she was here, she couldn't turn back. One evening, after a particularly successful rally, Kira stood on the steps of the city hall, looking out at the sea of people who had gathered to demand change. Her hand rested on her swollen belly, and she thought about the future. A future where her child could grow up without fear, where they wouldn't have to endure the same kind of hatred and injustice that she had. As the crowd chanted for justice, Kira allowed herself to smile. For the first time in weeks, she had fought back, and she had won. And though the road ahead was still long, she knew that she wasn't walking it alone. Justice had been served. But the fight for equality, for fairness, for a world free from the kind of hatred that had nearly destroyed her, was far from over, and Kira was ready for it. Thanks for watching. If you like this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes. We are preparing many more interesting and inspiring stories. Click on the bell to be notified about fresh videos, and be sure to check out the other stories on the channel. You'll love it. See you in the next video.